I told my therapist that I think my wife emotionally abused me. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I had always been someone who tried to make sense of things on my own, holding everything in, trying to protect the fragile structure I had built over the years. I was afraid of the consequences of speaking out, but something about being in the therapist's office surrounded by soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and the peaceful hum of a calm space made it feel easier. It felt like I had reached the point where I could no longer keep the truth buried, no matter how painful it was to admit. I think my wife emotionally abused me, I said. I almost choked on the words, surprised at the way they felt so foreign yet so real. The therapist, a woman I had been seeing for several months now, simply nodded. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she waited, allowing the weight of the statement to settle in the air between us. She knew this moment wasn't just about the words themselves, but about the years of pent-up emotion that had led me to this point. For years, I had justified her behavior. It wasn't her fault, I told myself. She was stressed, tired, or dealing with things I didn't understand. I thought maybe it was me, maybe I wasn't doing enough, maybe I wasn't the partner she needed me to be. I loved her, and surely, love could fix anything, right? I tried everything: patience, understanding, giving her space, offering to help, but nothing seemed to work. The more I tried, the more she seemed to retreat into herself, shutting me out with each passing day. I often found myself walking on eggshells, trying to avoid the arguments that seemed to break out of nowhere. Her sharp words and icy silences became a regular part of our lives, and over time, they wore me down, eroding my self-esteem. It wasn't always obvious. She didn't yell at me or call me names. Instead, it was the subtle comments, the dismissive gestures, the constant undermining of my thoughts, feelings, and opinions. There were the nights I'd be up late, trying to resolve something she had dismissed earlier, only to be met with sarcasm or a cold, dismissive shrug. I tried to talk to her about how I was feeling, but she would deflect or become defensive. She'd twist the conversation around, making me feel like I was the one overreacting or being too sensitive. The gaslighting, though I didn't have that term for it at the time, left me confused and questioning my own reality. I felt like I was losing myself, slowly and painfully. The more I doubted myself, the more I sought validation from her, but it was never enough. It started with small things: comments about my appearance, my work, the way I interacted with other people. She would belittle my achievements or make me feel small for the things I was proud of. If I tried to defend myself, it only seemed to fuel her anger, as if me standing up for myself was a betrayal. She would accuse me of not caring about her feelings, even though I was doing everything I could to make her happy. But nothing I did ever seemed to be enough. As time passed, I began to shrink. I couldn't make decisions without second-guessing myself. I couldn't trust my own judgment. The woman who had once been my partner became a stranger in my own home, and I didn't know how to fix it. And yet, despite everything, I stayed. I loved her, and I wanted to believe that things could get better. I convinced myself that if I tried harder, if I was better at reading her moods, if I worked harder at keeping the peace, things would improve. But every time I thought we were making progress, something would trigger her anger, and I'd find myself right back where I started, isolated and unsure of what was real. The therapy sessions had started as a way to work on my own issues, to understand why I felt so lost in my marriage. But today, something had shifted. I could no longer hold the weight of my feelings in silence. I had to say it out loud. I had to face the truth, even if it terrified me. The therapist didn't interrupt. She allowed me the space to breathe, to let the silence settle in. She asked me to take my time and explore what I meant. I told her about the arguments, the moments of walking on eggshells, the way she would sometimes go days without speaking to me or accuse me of things I hadn't done. I shared how I had been manipulated into believing it was my fault, how I had allowed myself to be convinced that I was the one causing the problems in the relationship. As I spoke, I realized just how much I had been holding in. I had spent so many years trying to protect the image of a perfect marriage, trying to convince myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But the truth was there, staring back at me. The emotional manipulation, the constant undermining, the way she had made me feel like I was walking through life without a solid foundation beneath me, it was all part of a toxic cycle that had only grown worse with time. I couldn't look at my wife the same way anymore. I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. The love I had once felt for her was clouded by the realization that, in many ways, she had never truly seen me. She had never respected me the way I had respected her. And somehow, I had allowed it to continue for far too long. But in that moment, sitting in front of the therapist, I understood something crucial. I wasn't to blame for her behavior. I had done everything I could to make the relationship work, to be the partner she needed me to be. The responsibility for the toxicity of our marriage didn't fall solely on my shoulders. It wasn't my fault that she couldn't, or wouldn't, take accountability for her own actions. I sat there, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I had finally acknowledged the truth, but sadness because I had allowed myself to become so entangled in a relationship that had drained me for so long. I knew that I couldn't change her. I couldn't fix what had been broken for so long. But I could change how I allowed myself to be treated moving forward. The therapist encouraged me to continue reflecting on the patterns I had been living in, to explore how I could start to rebuild my sense of self. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The realization was painful, but it was also the first step toward healing. When I left the therapist's office, I didn't feel like I had all the answers. The road ahead was still unclear, and I didn't know what the future held for my marriage. But I did know that I wasn't going to let her emotional abuse define me anymore. I wasn't going to let her actions diminish my worth. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right step. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever came next, not with fear or guilt, but with strength and hope for a future where I could finally heal. As the weeks passed after that therapy session, a slow shift began to occur within me. It wasn't a dramatic change, but rather a subtle transformation, a quiet awakening. I had finally admitted the truth to myself, and now, for the first time, I was giving myself permission to grieve. Grieve not just for the marriage I had hoped for, but for the person I had become in the process of losing myself. Each day, I became more aware of the emotional weight I had been carrying for so long. It wasn't just the hurtful comments or the silences that had been inflicted on me, but the years I had spent suppressing my own needs and desires in favor of keeping the peace. I had spent so much energy trying to fix things that I forgot to fix myself first. I had been so focused on holding up the fragile shell of our relationship that I didn't realize I was letting myself crack from the inside out. I started paying more attention to the small ways in which I was reclaiming my own space. I wasn't expecting it to happen overnight, but I could see the small victories. I made decisions for myself that didn't involve her or our marriage. I started to eat better, something I had neglected for so long, thinking it wasn't important. I joined a gym, something I hadn't done in years, not for her approval, but for me. I needed to feel strong again physically, emotionally, mentally. But the hardest part was when I came home after a long day, still filled with the thoughts of everything I had learned in therapy. I had to face her. I knew that she would never change unless she wanted to, but I had no control over that. I had learned that the power to heal had to come from within myself, not from her, and not from our marriage. Yet, each time I walked through that door, I was reminded of everything I had lost. The silence between us had become deafening, and the distance that had crept in over the years seemed wider now than ever. There were moments when I would look at her and feel nothing but sadness. It wasn't the anger I once held toward her. The anger had slowly dissipated over time, replaced by a quiet sorrow. She was a person who had hurt me, yes, but I had allowed her to do it. And the realization that I had been complicit in my own suffering by making excuses for her, by trying to justify the way she treated me, was almost more painful than the emotional abuse itself. At times, she seemed to notice the change in me, the subtle distance I was creating, though she didn't understand why. She would ask questions, but I found myself unable to answer them. How could I explain that, after all these years, I had finally realized how toxic our dynamic had become? How could I tell her that the person I had once been, the man who loved her fiercely, who would do anything to make her happy, was slowly vanishing? How could I tell her that my love for her, which had been my lifeblood for so long, had quietly withered away, suffocated by the years of neglect, manipulation, and emotional abuse? Instead, I buried my feelings, just as I had done for so many years. But now, I buried them for a different reason, not because I felt like I had to protect her or protect our marriage, but because I knew that it was time for me to take control of my own life. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for her to change. I wasn't waiting for her to come to some realization, or for her to beg for forgiveness. I wasn't waiting for her to see me the way I needed to be seen. I was learning to live for myself again. The hardest moment came one night, when I realized that I had reached a breaking point. I had spent years adjusting to her moods, putting up with her emotional outbursts, apologizing for things I didn't do, but I could no longer deny that I had been sacrificing myself for the sake of a marriage that had been fundamentally broken. I could no longer convince myself that this was the life I wanted, or that I was content living in this cycle of manipulation and hurt. It wasn't a dramatic event. There were no outbursts or explosive arguments. It was simply the quiet moment of realization when I understood that I couldn't stay in this toxic space any longer, no matter how much I had loved her or wanted to make it work. I wasn't the person I used to be, and I could feel the remnants of who I had once been slipping away. It was time to let go, not for her, not for anyone else, but for me. The truth was, I didn't want to be in this relationship anymore. I had been emotionally abused, and the weight of it had become too much to bear. I realized that I had spent so long putting her needs above my own, trying to make her happy at the expense of my own mental and emotional well-being, that I had lost sight of who I was. I knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be pain, more tears, and more uncertainty. There would be questions about how we got here, and where we would go next. But one thing was clear: I was no longer going to allow her behavior to dictate the course of my life. I was no longer going to stay for the sake of staying. I was no longer going to protect her at the cost of my own soul. In that stillness, a feeling of peace began to settle within me. I didn't need to have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I had begun to reclaim myself. And that, in itself, was enough to start moving forward. It wasn't about vengeance or hatred. It was simply about survival. I had spent so long losing myself, and now, I was finally learning how to find myself again. And that was the most important thing of all. The days that followed were a blur of internal conflict and external tension. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere between my wife and me. While I had found some peace within myself, she seemed unaware of the weight of my emotions, or maybe she just didn't want to acknowledge it. It was as if I were living in two separate worlds, one where I had finally begun to reclaim myself, and the other where I was still trapped in a marriage that had long ago ceased to nourish me. The silence between us was deafening. It wasn't just the lack of conversation, but the unspoken understanding that things weren't right. There were no more casual touches, no more shared laughter, no more intimacy of any kind. I wasn't sure if she noticed or if she cared. I no longer had the energy to pretend that everything was okay. Each time I looked at her, I felt a pang of sadness, not because I hated her, but because I realized that I could never be the person I wanted to be as long as I remained in this relationship. I started spending more time outside of the house. I threw myself into work, not because I loved it, but because it gave me space. It gave me an excuse to avoid the painful truth: I was becoming a stranger in my own life. And the longer I stayed in this stagnant, toxic marriage, the further I drifted from who I once was. But even in the chaos of work, there were moments of clarity. I found myself sitting at my desk, taking a deep breath, and feeling a rare sense of peace. For the first time in years, I realized I could breathe again without the weight of someone else's emotions crushing my chest. The therapy sessions continued, and each week, I found myself unraveling more layers of the emotional turmoil I had buried for so long. The therapist helped me understand that emotional abuse doesn't always look like physical violence or explosive outbursts. Sometimes, it's subtle and insidious. It's the constant erosion of your sense of self, the way small dismissals over time can add up to a complete undermining of your worth. And slowly, bit by bit, I began to see how deeply this had affected me. I wasn't just dealing with the pain of the marriage itself, but with the loss of who I had become. As the weeks turned into months, the question began to loom larger in my mind: could I continue like this? Could I stay in a relationship that had been toxic for so long, hoping for change that was never going to come? Or was it time to let go? I tried to imagine a future without her. It felt impossible at first, like the very foundation of my life would crumble beneath me. But slowly, as I spent more time focusing on my own healing and growth, I began to realize that I had spent so long living in the shadow of this relationship that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand in the light of my own life. I had forgotten what it was like to have a sense of purpose outside of trying to fix someone else's brokenness. And then, one night, after weeks of soul-searching and reflecting on my own well-being, I finally reached a decision. It wasn't a decision I took lightly, but it was one that I knew deep down was the only choice that could lead to my healing. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of a marriage that was no longer healthy or fulfilling. I had to let go. I knew that doing so would be painful. There would be hurt, there would be anger, and there would be heartbreak. But I also knew that it was the only way I could truly move forward. The thought of having to leave, of facing the consequences of that decision, terrified me. But the idea of staying in a marriage that drained me, where I had been made to feel less than, was even more terrifying. The next day, I walked into the house, feeling an unfamiliar calmness settling over me. I knew what I had to do, and the moment felt heavy with everything I had been holding in for so long. As I stood there, I realized I wasn't walking away from her, but from a version of myself that I had lost. I was walking toward a future where I could reclaim my happiness, my self-worth, and my peace. I wasn't just leaving the marriage, I was leaving the emotional chains that had bound me for so long. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in. Her eyes met mine, but there was no real connection there. She could sense the change in me, though she didn't fully understand what it meant. The silence between us stretched, thick and heavy, but I knew this was the moment I had been avoiding for so long. I couldn't stay in the role I had allowed myself to be cast in. I couldn't continue being the person I had become in this toxic relationship. And in that moment, I realized something incredibly important. I didn't need her approval to move on. I didn't need her permission to heal. I stepped forward, took a deep breath, and made the most difficult decision of my life. I had to let go. Leaving wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't a neat, clean break. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was messy, painful, and raw, but it was also liberating. For the first time in so many years, I felt a flicker of hope. There was still a long road ahead, full of recovery and healing, but I knew that by walking away, I was choosing to prioritize my own well-being. I was choosing to stop letting someone else's dysfunction dictate my life. As I walked out that door, I didn't feel victorious, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Freedom from the emotional chains that had bound me, freedom to rebuild myself, freedom to find a path where I could finally heal. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew it was a path I needed to take for myself. The days after I left were a blur, each one heavier than the last, but also, in its own way, a release. It was like walking out of a fog, where the weight that had pressed down on me for so long was now lifted, though the space left behind was unsettling. There were moments when I second-guessed myself, wondering if I had made the right choice. The fear of the unknown, of being alone, crept in during those quiet, lonely nights, but I refused to let it take hold. I had spent too long in a state of emotional suffocation, and the idea of returning to that darkness, even for familiarity, was unthinkable. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, but it felt like a sanctuary. The place was empty at first, save for the bare essentials. But I filled it with things that felt like me: a few plants, an old guitar I hadn't touched in years, books I'd forgotten I loved. I wasn't sure yet who I was outside of the roles I had played in my marriage. I had been someone's husband, someone's emotional caretaker, for so long that I had forgotten the man I was before all of that, the man I wanted to be again. In the early days, the silence was deafening. I missed the sound of her voice, even though it was often filled with bitterness. I missed the routine, the false sense of security it gave me. But I also missed my own voice, the one that had been muffled by years of suppressing my own needs. I missed the version of myself who could laugh without worrying, who could dream without being questioned. But most of all, I missed the man who believed he was worthy of love and peace. In therapy, I began to explore the roots of my decisions, the reasons why I had stayed for so long in a relationship that had drained me. The therapist helped me see that it wasn't just about her behavior, but about my own inability to acknowledge my worth, my right to be treated with respect. I had allowed myself to be caught in a cycle of emotional manipulation because I had convinced myself that I wasn't deserving of anything better. But now, I was learning that I deserved happiness not just as a concept, but in real, tangible ways. Every day was a struggle, but also a small victory. I started reaching out to old friends, reconnecting with people I had pushed away during the years of isolation in my marriage. Some friendships had faded, but others were stronger than ever. It was humbling to realize how much I had neglected the people who had once been my support system. But it was also comforting to see that they were still there, willing to help me rebuild. Despite the progress, there were moments when the pain of the past still hit hard. I would wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of her. The accusations she had made, the way she had belittled me when I was at my lowest. The way she had twisted everything to fit her narrative, leaving me feeling powerless. Those moments of doubt and guilt often resurfaced, especially when I allowed myself to wonder what could have been different if I had tried harder, if I had been more patient. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't keep living in a what-if world. The truth was undeniable. I had done everything I could, and I had given more of myself than I had ever realized. But sometimes, no matter how much you love someone, it's not enough to fix a broken relationship. One of the most difficult days came when I saw her again. It wasn't planned, but we ran into each other in the grocery store. The moment was surreal. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and her presence sent a rush of emotions through me. I didn't know what I expected, but certainly not the cold, distant stare she gave me as we stood face to face. The space between us was palpable, and it felt like the years we had spent together had vanished in an instant. There was nothing left to say, no more promises to keep. It was then that I realized how far I had come. The ache in my chest was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight I couldn't carry. I had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side, scarred but stronger. The woman who had once been my everything was now someone I had to let go of, not just physically, but emotionally. The hardest part was accepting that she may never truly understand the depth of what I had endured. But it wasn't about her understanding anymore. It was about me accepting that I was worthy of something more, something healthier, something real. And that meant I had to let go of the version of her I had kept in my mind, the version of her that I had tried to change, fix, and save. That afternoon, after our brief encounter in the store, I went home and looked around my small apartment. It was still a work in progress and finished, like me, but it was mine. It was a space where I could heal. I realized that healing wasn't a straight line, and it wasn't easy, but it was happening. I was learning how to be alone without being lonely, how to fill the silence with my own thoughts rather than the remnants of a relationship that had torn me apart. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would find love again or if I would be forever haunted by the ghosts of my past. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I was learning how to live for myself, to value myself, to trust myself. And that, in itself, was the first step toward a future where I could breathe freely again.